This is A History of Oil, Episode 5, Pleasant Harmony. Last time on A History of Oil, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company sparked outrage and a few flash mobs after word leaked that it was secretly colluding with the railroads to fix prices and squeeze the competition. After news of the scheme got out, independent oilmen learned that they had been unknowingly subsidizing the very same company that was pricing them out of the market. But even if Rockefeller had a hammerlock on most of the competition, the hardscrabble oilmen in northwestern Pennsylvania were not about to take this lying down. What they needed was to find a new way to get their oil to market, and that new way would become the world's very first long distance oil pipeline. It was called the Tidewater Project. In the end, it would span 109 miles, overcome a number of imposing technical and geographic challenges, and for a very brief time, it would break Standard Oil's grip on the oil regions. One of the driving forces behind the Tidewater Project was a man named Byron Benson. Together with a number of other partners, Benson's plan was to lay a 6-inch pipe up and over the Allegheny Mountains. That would bypass the usual routes and link up with the Reading Railroad in the town of Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Well, hold on, wait a minute. Weren't the railroads conspiring with Standard Oil to prevent competition? Well, the answer is yes, but not all of them. You see, up until this point, the Reading Railroad didn't have a piece of the oil shipping business. This meant that the Reading wasn't a member of that Southern Improvement Company. Remember the kickback scheme we discussed in the last episode? And it also meant that if this pipeline concept worked, the Reading Railroad would make a tiny profit by accepting all of the new oil cargo bound for Philadelphia and New York. It was so appealing that the Reading Railroad even put up some of Tidewater's early startup capital. The problem was that no one had ever pumped oil more than 30 miles, let alone up and over a mountain. Worse yet, the Tidewater men had to deal with an even bigger challenge than high pressure pipes, frozen ground, and the daunting Alleghenies. The bigger problem? Standard Oil did not want this pipeline to be built, not unless Standard had a piece of the action. To put Rockefeller and his men off the scent, the Tidewater men commissioned false surveys and produced fake routes for the project. Ever resourceful, Standard did them one better. It tried to get the exclusive rights to build its own pipeline across the entire length of Pennsylvania, north to south. This would cut off the east to west pipeline that the Tidewater boys were trying to build. Standard's dead line was never really intended to transport oil, only to block everyone else from getting a line out of the oil regions. Standard spent a lot of money buying up these rights, but eventually Tidewater found a way through. And once construction began, there was little stopping it. After a Herculean construction effort, on May 28, 1879, the Tidewater Pipeline was finally ready. On that day, all sorts of people began to collect along the pipeline route. Standard men, rail men, newspaper journalists, and a lot of curious onlookers. Standing near a gigantic 75 horsepower pump at station number 1 in Corryville, Pennsylvania, Benson said a few appropriate words. He tried to hold back his emotions, and then he opened Tidewater's first valve. True to form, the oilmen immediately began taking bets. The best odds said that Tidewater wouldn't produce more than a trickle. But 7 days later, and to Benson's great relief, the oil flowed freely into Tidewater's holding tanks at Williamsport. The long distance pipeline was here to stay, and another milestone in the history of oil was made. From Standard Oil's point of view, Tidewater represented a very real threat to the company's core business model: control. Rockefeller had seen what overproduction and wild self interest, as he saw it, had done to the price of oil, forcing it to gyrate from boom to bust and back again. The introduction of an alternative pipeline, well, that was an unacceptable crack in the dam that Standard Oil had created. That dam held back the deluge of competition. And if there was a crack in that dam, it had to be fixed. As a result, Standard built not one or two, but four competing pipelines that all led out of the oil regions. Within a year, Standard was even a minority shareholder in Tidewater itself. What had started as a bold alternative to Standard Oil eventually became just another cog in the company's complex transportation system. The deluge had to be controlled, or it meant the end for everyone. However, many of the independent oilmen didn't see the business in these same terms. From their point of view, Standard was the anaconda, a giant beast that would squeeze anyone and everyone until they eventually cried uncle or were consumed whole. By the end of the 1870s, it was now obvious that if you were going to go up against Standard Oil, you were going to need more than an innovative plan and some insane engineering. You were going to need politicians and judges. By the end of this decade, a number of oilmen had launched a salvo of legal challenges against Standard in the court system. In New York State, for example, legislators were convening hearings to investigate the railroad pricing schemes that Standard was involved in. And even though Standard was, not a railroad company, it was the primary target of their investigation. Gradually, the gears and mechanisms of the Standard machine would be fully exposed to the public view. Many people were shocked to see just how fast and extensive this former goods grocer from Ohio had become. In one article for the Atlantic Monthly, journalist Henry Lloyd penned one of the many exposés on Standard's business practices. Something had to be done about Standard. But what? You see, if you were going to go up against John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, you suddenly faced a rather curious problem. No one, and I mean no one, actually owned Standard Oil. At least that's how it looked from the outside. What was the precise relationship between John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company and a complicated network of refineries that dotted the United States? Well, if you subpoenaed Rockefeller and put him under oath, he could confidently state, for the record, so help me God, that no legal relationship existed at all. Relationships between the various components of Standard's empire were simply pleasant, and the whole operation worked together in harmony. Individual subsidiaries, well, they weren't subsidiaries at all. They were only united in a common quest to produce dividends. So, who owns the subsidiaries? Well, not the Standard Oil Company. That would be illegal. Nice trick, right? Well, here's how it worked. In 1882, ownership of every pipe, barrel, pencil, and paperclip belonging to 40 separate corporations. These were all corporations under Rockefeller's domain. Well, they were transferred from the Standard Oil Company to something called the Standard Oil Trust. This was a legal entity that was managed, but not necessarily owned, by a board of trustees. Ownership of the trust was then divided into 700,000 shares. Rockefeller held the overwhelming majority of these shares, with 27%, followed by his trustee deputy, Henry Flagler, who held the second largest chunk, at 9%, and there were 41 shareholders in all. But legally speaking, they only owned the trust, not the company. And like all responsible shareholders, their interest was in general supervision of Standard. As a result, shareholders might select themselves to be, say, the director of an individual subsidiary of Standard. But legally speaking, they could only speak to their ownership of the trust and not the company. Did Standard Oil control large swaths of the American oil industry? Oh, that was hard to say. You'd have to ask Standard's Domestic Trade Committee or the Pipeline Committee. And the most devious trick of all, if you put any of the directors of these committees under oath and asked them, "Do you order anyone in the company to do anything?" they would say time and time again, under oath, "Of course not." They simply made requests. For a very long while, this legal sleight of hand seemed to work for Standard. But it was not powerful enough to break that spell which Standard Oil had cast on the American imagination in the 1870s and 1880s. If anything, it made Standard's brand reputation even worse. Viewed from the inside, Standard's problem wasn't some ink stained journalist looking to see their name in print. Neither was it the annoying threat of extradition to stand before some obscure court in Pennsylvania. These things they could all be handled with a mixture of quiet disdain or a call to the governor of New York, depending on the circumstances. No, the problem from inside Standard Oil was that the entire Standard Oil system was built on, well, oil. And if the oil stopped, so did the ride. Was oil some cosmic accident, a substance so unique that it only existed in the hills of Pennsylvania? Was there even enough oil to last the next decade? What about the next year? No one less than the state geologist of Pennsylvania had recently predicted that this strange phenomenon of oil, well, it was just a fluke, one that would be exhausted in a single lifetime. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was wrong. But was it really a wise business move to plow millions of dollars of the company's money into a new refinery if there wouldn't be enough oil left to refine it at the end of the year? How much would the shares of the Standard Oil Trust be worth if there was no more oil left to refine? Before long, the warnings that the oil was running out were no longer coming from the state geologist of Pennsylvania. They were coming from inside the company itself. Geologists and experts hired by Standard had calculated that the odds of finding oil elsewhere were at least 100 to 1 against, and the terminal decline of American oil production was now imminent. One Standard director, John Archibald, was so convinced that the end was nigh that he began to sell off some of his shares in the company at a discount. "Oh, don't sell now, John. There's talk of oil farther out west." Archibald famously responded by saying, "Why, I'll drink every gallon of oil produced west of the Mississippi." Next time on A History of Oil, John Archibald drinks every gallon as the oil industry pushes far beyond Pennsylvania. Rockefeller is about to make a headlong plunge into this new frontier and learn a very important lesson about looking before you leap. This is A History of Oil.